So I've been uncontrollably binge watching Derren Brown for the last week or so, which gave me the idea for this video. If you don't know Derren Brown, he's this hypnotist slash magician extraordinaire. He's a household name and he's absolutely huge, especially in the UK. Over the last 25 years or so, he's pulled off some amazing stunts, varying from dangerous to just downright unbelievable. Definitely go and check him out after this, especially if you haven't heard of him before. Anyway, quite a few of his shows have involved him hypnotizing people, either to get them to commit a crime or what they believe to be a crime, or often simply hypnotizing people to steal from them as a demonstration. Two of the most significant ones which come to memory are the time he managed to convince normal law-abiding middle management people into stealing cash from a bank van outside of the Bank of England, which of course was staged for their safety, but the participants didn't know it was fake. Another time, he also managed to hypnotize a guy into game-ending Stephen Fry in a theatre. Again, of course, the weapon wasn't real, Stephen Fry didn't actually get shot, but the guy didn't know that.
Which is, let's be honest, it's pissing into the wind. You can't.
Stephen, happy get?
Oh, good.
Well done.
Phew. There we are. Oh.
Derren Brown's act is especially impressive because there are so many different skills that he draws from. He's proven time and time again that yes, he's a great hypnotist and he really can hypnotize people with relative ease. But then on top of that, he's also incredibly skilled at sleight of hand, misdirection, and mentalism, which is a type of magic which allows you to basically pretend to read minds, and that often involves a blend of all of the above. I have no doubt that if he rolled out of bed on the wrong side one day, he would be more than capable of pulling off some pretty impressive heists, like some kind of evil supervillain mastermind. I mean, luckily for the sake of entertainment, he's pickpocketed countless people, bought a ring by paying for it with blank sheets of paper rather than cash, and even managed to steal someone's artwork from a gallery after telling them he was going to do so just to prove a point. But today we're going to look at a specific case from Copenhagen 1951 where there actually was real-life hypnosis and a very serious crime committed. So without further ado, let's get into it. Some of the details of this story are slightly blurry, by the way, since there are a ton of sources which contradict each other, but I've tried my absolute hardest to make this as accurate as possible. If there are any corrections, I'll add them in pinned comment, you know, the usual. On March the 29th, 1951, a 28-year-old male named Palle Hardrup walked briskly into a Copenhagen bank. His identity was obscured by a black hat pulled firmly down, paired with a large scarf to mask his nose, mouth and chin. He was armed with a briefcase and a gun. Upon entering the branch, Palle headed straight to the front and placed a briefcase down on the counter. "Fill it with money," he instructs. Well, he actually said something in Danish, but, you know, come on, I'm not going to try that. The frankly terrified cashier was frozen with shock momentarily. Bank robberies were relatively rare in 1950s Denmark, but regardless, a masked man brandishing a gun in your face is going to make you brick it. Unfortunately, this brief hesitation wasn't appreciated. 2 gunshots rang out. Palle had shot the cashier dead. He slumped to the ground and his assistant met a similar fate with another 2 gunshots. Palle had fluffed up the robbery. With the staff being put involuntarily into an indefinite sleep, they were hardly in a state to fill Palle's briefcase with cash, so he walked out of the bank, hopped on his bicycle, and went straight home. I mean, how Danish is that? You try and rob a bank, fail, and then just get back on your bike. At least he was eco-friendly, I guess. After a long and arduous trial, at the time one of the lengthiest in Danish history, it was concluded that Palle Hardrup, then 33, had committed a double murder. Not only that, but he had done so as a result of being under the influence of hypnosis. That's right, there were actually 3 victims in this disastrous case. So, who hypnotized Palle, why him, and how? This terrifying story, which ultimately ended with tragedy and jail, also started in a similar way. Palle Hardrup was no stranger to being on the wrong side of the law after finding himself jailed for having worked for the Gestapo during the German occupation of Denmark around World War II. In fact, he had been in jail up until just a couple of months before the robbery. Despite being in jail, it's understood that Palle was actually a highly agreeable, respectful and polite man. Whilst in jail, he met an older man by the name of Bjorn Nielsen. They got on fairly well since Nielsen was doing time for his cooperation with the enemy during the war, so they had that in common. It's also understood that Palle had an interest in religion and spirituality, which Nielsen would go on to use to his advantage. Nielsen encouraged Palle to experiment with hypnosis and yoga and understand spirituality and religion. I'm not entirely sure whether all of these were interlinked or he was just picking up on Palle's interests. Palle was at first hesitant to trust Nielsen. After all, he would spool off tall tales to Palle whilst the two were jailed together, explaining how he was this expert in religion and a yoga guru. Despite the initial hesitance from Palle, Nielsen never backed down and kept poking away, with more and more grandiose claims of being able to help Palle reach spiritual enlightenment, and explained how hypnosis would be highly beneficial in helping him to find more meaning and truth in the world. Interestingly, it seems that Nielsen avoided ever directly calling it hypnosis when talking to Palle, instead preferring to use more euphemistic terms so as to avoid suspicion. So, hypnosis sessions would instead be called concentrations or relaxation exercises, that sort of thing. For the sake of brevity, I'm going to skip through this bit, partly. In order to hypnotize someone to such a significant extent that you would be able to essentially program them into doing something as complex and seemingly conscious as going outside, hopping on a bike, robbing a bank, and leaving, is not as simple as just a simple hypnosis exercise. It took Nielsen months of continuous sessions, gaslighting, and manipulation to make Palle vulnerable enough for such a significant, deeply immoral act to be involuntary for poor Palle. In order to prepare him, Nielsen had to desensitize Palle's sense of morality. In what can only be described as one of the most evil things I've ever heard, Nielsen made Palle experience the feeling of murdering his own mother via hallucination repeatedly until he felt like he had lived through the act countless times and it no longer affected him. It's hard to emphasize just how much of a toll this must have taken on Palle mentally, to be tortured by Nielsen repeatedly whilst being almost permanently in a trance by the end of the process. Eventually, Nielsen was released from prison a short while before Palle. Whilst the two were separated physically, Nielsen's work had largely already been done. Palle had been reprogrammed to believe in the spiritual guidings of X. So all Nielsen had to do to instruct Palle however he wished was send him a letter and say it was from X. After months of work from a psychiatrist, the remaining gaps were all answered by Palle. The issue was that Palle didn't seem to entirely understand what had happened himself. At first, after his arrest, Palle told the police that the purpose behind attempting to rob the bank was in order to collect funds to help reform society. Despite being a highly qualified and capable psychiatrist, Professor E. Reiter ended up having to rely on injecting some kind of truth serum to get the answers out of Palle. Once under the influence, Palle explained to the psychiatrist that he had entered into the experiments with Nielsen to try to work out the puzzle of life, whatever that means. This newspaper article from the time doesn't make it entirely clear, but I think this basically means that Palle, having been misled by Nielsen, was voluntarily undergoing hypnosis, which is how Nielsen was able to manipulate and convince Palle that he needed to rob the bank. It seems that Bjorn Nielsen had managed to convince Palle that he was protected by a powerful spirit simply called X. Despite making no logical sense, Nielsen said that this spirit, through himself, would instruct Palle every day. If Palle failed to comply with the spirit's demands, then he would be banished to suffer in eternal damnation. Quite amazingly, the spirit also demanded that Palle would not succumb to hypnosis from any individual other than Bjorn Nielsen. Now, I don't entirely understand the ins and outs of hypnosis to a great extent, but the idea that you could hypnotize someone into not being hypnotized by anyone else is fascinating. It sounds like a delusion of Nielsen to think he could have this level of influence over Palla, but this could possibly explain why the psychiatrist found it nearly impossible to break through and get any information at all out of Palla, even with the assistance of a powerful truth drug. After the truth serum was in Palla's system, it's reported that he experienced serious adverse side effects. He fainted, passed out multiple times, and was in a state of torment. Eventually, despite the extreme aversion to let go of whatever Nielsen had somehow mentally bottled up inside of him, the truth all came out. Palla Hardrup willingly signed a written statement in which he confirmed that at the time of the robbery and subsequent murders, he was under complete control of Nielsen. Immediately after all of this came to light, Nielsen was arrested. Of course, he pleaded innocent, claiming that Palla's story was a complete fabrication. However, 40 statements from wardens and inmates didn't help his side of the story. Dozens of wardens and prisoners alike reported that they had seen Bjorn hypnotizing Palla and putting him into a trance-like state. It took the jury an entire month's worth of deliberating and trying to understand whether or not it is in fact possible to hypnotize someone into committing such a cold-blooded and violent crime. Eventually, after asking for as much evidence as possible from as many experts as possible, they reached the verdict that Palla had been hypnotized into committing the robbery, and Nielsen was the mastermind behind the entire thing. Interestingly, I think what completely sold the jury on it was Professor Reiter. He explained in court that after they finally managed to break through this mental lock that Nielsen had managed to put up, Palla was still incredibly susceptible to hypnosis as a result. He demonstrated that by simply mentioning the letter P, he could cause Palla to drop the telephone in his hand and fall asleep immediately, into a state which only the professor was able to wake him from. Depending on where your thoughts are on this story, you might be pleased to know that Palla, instead of being sent to serve a life sentence in a normal prison, was sent for treatment in a psychiatric institution. This was nevertheless a life sentence. Nielsen, on the other hand, was sent away to serve life in prison. He was eventually paroled in 1967 and eventually took the easy way out in 1971, poisoning himself in his apartment. Palla, on the other hand, was eventually pardoned of his crimes and released from psychiatric detention, also in 1967. In an attempt to distance himself from his complex, traumatic past, he changed his name to Palla Vishman and cut himself off from anything that could connect him to the robbery. So secretive was his past that his girlfriend had no idea before he passed away in 2012. Palla's parents were, of course, devastated by the mental toll that Nielsen's countless hours of psychological manipulation had taken on their son, and I have no doubt that there were permanent remnants of what he went through which he must have struggled to battle with for years after Nielsen had subjected him to such a brutal regime. Luckily, given that he was considered fit enough to be discharged from psychiatric detention, through a lot of help he was able to live a mostly normal life. I find the Copenhagen Hypnosis murders to be one of the most interesting crimes in relatively recent history, and I know I'm certainly not alone. It's an intriguing enough story that there have been a number of books, films, and TV shows written based on the events over the years in both Danish and English. I've left a couple of links down below to a few of those, as well as a Derren Brown special where he manages to convince a man to game-end Stephen Fry. Thankfully, Derren has uploaded this one to his channel for us to watch for free, so I would highly recommend you go and check that show out if you'd like to understand a little more about how pulling off a crime like this could have been performed. With that being said, thank you so much for watching. I'm always looking for new curiosities and strange stories to cover, so if you have any recommendations for what you would like me to look into, then make sure you leave a comment and I might make a video on a topic of your choice. Finally, I wanted to leave you with one last bit. When Palla was arrested after the failed robbery, they also suspected him of being behind another bank robbery, but the money was never found.